Hi, welcome to this webisode of Brainstorming with Billy the Brain. I'm your host, Bill Frank, and it isn't often that I get the opportunity to talk to a true legend, somebody who has influenced rock and roll music not only in this country but in Great Britain as well. Today, however, I have that opportunity. Joining me from a remote location somewhere in Northern California is Tom Lodge. Now, the name may not be familiar to a lot of American audiences, but Tom Lodge was absolutely critical in the development of rock and roll music in Great Britain in the early 1960s. Tom was part of a band of what they called pirate radio operators that held a radio station out in the English Channel just outside of territorial waters of Great Britain, broadcasting rock and roll music to the music-starved teens of Great Britain in the early 1960s. So, Tom, welcome to the show. Glad to have you here.
Thank you, Bill.
Well, it's a pleasure to have a pioneer such as yourself. But here in the United States, many of us don't realize what it is that you were experiencing in Great Britain at the time. So set the scene for us, would you please? What was rock and roll music and BBC in Great Britain in the early 1960s?
Yeah, in 1964, the BBC, which was the only radio station of the country controlled by the government, did not like rock and roll. And in fact, what they used to do in order to play popular music, they would have live musician or recorded live musicians play string versions of American hits. So that was the kind of pop music you had in England. We didn't like that at all. You know? So we were, at the same time, there was an underground thing happening with many young teenagers who had got records from American sailors of blues and rock and roll, and they had learnt them on the guitars and keyboards and drums. And there was an underground thing with clubs happening. And so we decided this is the music we had to play, but the only way we could play it if we created our own radio station. So we got a ship, put it off the coast in international waters, so we weren't breaking any laws, and broadcast rock and roll into England.
Well, it's a fascinating story, Tom, and the whole concept of going offshore to broadcast back was absolutely ingenious. Who came up with the idea, and then how did you get involved with what was to become Radio Caroline?
Well, the founder of Radio Caroline was an Irishman called Ronan O'Reilly. At the time, I was working for the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, and I walked into a pub in Chelsea in London, and the music that was playing at the bar there was Perry Como, What Did Delaware? And I said to the bartender, that's pretty awful music. And he said, well, that's the best we got. And then this voice pipes up just a little way down on the bar saying, hey, don't you be worrying. We'll soon be playing the finest rock and roll. And I heard this Irish accent. I thought, who are you? How are you going to do that? And he said, we got a ship off the coast, and we're going to be broadcasting rock and roll very soon. I said, can I join you? That's my passion, is rock and roll and the ocean. And we talked a bit, and we shook hands, and that was how I joined Radio Caroline.
Now, you joined in the capacity of a DJ, one of the original DJs on Radio Caroline. So tell us, what was it like broadcasting offshore on board a ship in the middle of the English Channel?
Well, it was actually in the North Sea and the Irish Sea. We were off the southeast coast of England and off the Isle of Man between Ireland and Northern England. We had two ships, in fact. But to be on a ship with the storms and so on, sometimes we'd have to have the microphone suspended so that it wouldn't pick up the engine sounds. And we had to stick coins on top of the pickup head to keep the needle in the groove, because as the ship rolled, otherwise it might bounce out. You know, that was the sort of thing we had to do.
Primitive conditions, to say the least,
yeah.
As you were trying to broadcast this rock and roll. So the people, the children, the teenagers of Great Britain at the time were hungry for this music. How was Radio Caroline accepted?
Within a few months, we had 24 million listeners. I believe the largest audience to one transmitter ever in the history of radio. I don't know for sure, but it was phenomenal. I mean, we gave a platform to musicians who were working class kids playing the guitars, and we created the Who, the Yardbirds, the Hollies, the Kinks, all these British groups which created the British music invasion. In fact, on my book here, there's a quote from Pete Townsend of The Who. He said, without Radio Caroline, we would not have sold a single record. So there's the book.
Well, that's a glowing testimonial from one of rock's legends, Pete Townsend.
Yeah, yeah.
So I have to ask you the question, these are groups that we now know as household names. You're saying
Yes.
back in '64 they were unknowns. How did you, quote unquote, discover them?
Well, once you went on the air, we were hungry for more and more music, and there was all this latent talent playing just into the local clubs and so on. And we said, that's the music. In fact, Ronan had already created a club in London called The Scene. He, in fact, gave the first equipment to the Rolling Stones before they joined Lou Goldham. And he also brought the Animals to the surface and many other rock and roll groups. And that's what we played. That's what we were most excited about. We didn't like What Did Delaware?
No, I can understand that, and Perry Como too. But let me ask you this. Now, after all these years, you've written the book, The Ship That Rocked the World, the story of Radio Caroline. And people who buy that book, what are they going to learn after they read your story?
Well, I've got to also quote the subtitle because that will help answer your question. It says, how Radio Caroline defied the establishment, launched the British invasion, and made the planet safe for rock and roll. And that's what my book is about. My personal experience, I was on both the South Ship and the North Ship. I was shipwrecked on the South Ship. There was a wonderful story with MI5, who was told to get rid of us. October 1966, I met this MI5 guy a few years ago, and he told me he had instructions from Brigadier General George Dixon to get the SAS boys, which is a SWAT team, and a helicopter, and come onto our ship and get rid of us. And he told the general, he said, sir, I can't do that. And he said, why? He said, because all the SAS boys are fans of Radio Caroline.
Love it. What a great story. Now, there are many more stories like that in the book, The Ship That Rocked the World. Yes. But as you look back over your career and everything, Tom, the time that you spent with Radio Caroline, what do you want people to most remember from that period of history?
Well, the energy and the enthusiasm that us, a bunch of young fellows, all in our 20s, not like that movie Pirate Radio where they were all middle-aged. We were young. These young fellows were determined, had the passion to change something in the culture. See, before that, the British, the English was so stiff upper lip and so stuffy, and if you're working class, you stayed there for the rest of your life because of your accent. We broke that. We made working class kids into millionaires. We broke the whole thing. In fact, we created this, what's called the swinging 60s in England. That whole image of England would not have existed without Radio Caroline.
An incredible story, Tom. If people want to find out more, find your book, where would you direct them to look for your book? Or is there a website that you would give them that they could go to learn more?
Yeah, they can go to shipthatrocked.com. And there's also a video on that site as well as a way you can purchase a book, but you can also go to Amazon. And the book is available wherever books are sold.
That's great. Tom Lodge, thank you for being our special guest on this webisode of Brainstorming with Billy the Brain. You are truly one of the pioneers of early rock and roll radio in Great Britain. Thank you for bringing this underreported, undertold story to a lot of listeners here in the United States.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you.